Okay, welcome all. So, in today's class, we will be looking at a poem by J.M. Hopkins. It is entitled Felix Randal. And you know that Hopkins is a poet, and at the same time, he was a priest. So, this text was written in 1880, but it was not published until 1918. Okay, and this text is at the same time an elegy and an eulogy, okay, for this person entitled or called Felix Randal. And you can see that Hopkins, whose poetry is so unusual in its combination of the religious dedication and the technical kind of experimentation that characterized his verses. And in this text, he writes an elegy because it is a sort of lamentation for Felix Randal, the farrier. But the text is not an elegy in the conventional sense of the term because it is an eulogy at the same time. That is a poem of praise. Okay, so here you can see that Hopkins is also praising this person, Felix Randal, who was a common man. Okay, he was a farrier who actually mends horses' shoes. So Gerald Manley Hopkins, who was a poet and a priest at the same time, and this amalgamation of both the profession is at work in this poem. And this poem is to some extent autobiographical because it deals with the personal experiences of Hopkins's own life. Okay, and you know that Hopkins was not really a poet per se. Okay, he was a priest and he was a part of the religious order that was known as the Society of Jesus, okay, or who were called as Jesuits. Okay, so Jesuits, they actually followed a strict code of self denial and place emphasis on a process that is known as contemplation, a process where a person gradually learns to appreciate the presence of God in all things. Okay, and Felix Randal is that type of poem where we find that the poet, as a priest, is offering that religious healing towards that person. So here you find a wonderful balance between his poetic craft and his religious nature that characterizes Hopkins's poetry. And this text, to some extent, also deals with the relationship between a priest and a common man. Okay, so that's why you find that the poet is talking about, the poet is writing about this young man who died actually, or who had a sort of premature death. So this text sets off, or this sonnet sets off with this line that Felix Randal the farrier, oh, is he dead then? My duty all ended, who have watched his mold of man, big boned and hardy, handsome, pining and pining till time when reason rambled in it and some fatal for disorders, fleshed there all contented. So the opening lines They reflect on the death of a blacksmith called Felix Randal, and who Hopkins had ministered to in his capacity as a priest. And the opening lines describe the death of Felix Randal. And the poet is filled with a sense of loss, a sense of melancholy at the death of this common man. And he is refusing to accept the reality. Oh, is he really dead? Okay. So the lines or the phrase suggest that the poet had a responsibility towards Randal. He had a pastoral responsibility to Randal because as a priest, he need to administer the spiritual guidance, the spiritual comfort during his illness. As a priest, his duty was to look after the members of his parish, to take care of them, to provide them with the religious comfort, with the spiritual guidance. So that was his duty. Okay. So now, after the death of Felix Randal, the poet thinks that his duty has ended. He says, my duty all ended. So now that Felix has died, the poet's duty has ended, which might imply a sense of sorrow. And he writes then, who have watched his mold of man, big boned and hardy handsome. So it describes the poet's observation of Randal's physical prowess, the mold of a man. Okay, so this mold is an object that can be used to replicate a particular shape. So a man-shaped mold could be used to make numerous man-shaped statues, but they would all be cast from the original mold. So the mold of man, it shows that there is something essential about Randall, almost a sort of ideal physical form. Okay, so the mold of man, this phrase refers to his handsome physique. Mold of man refers to Randall's robust body. Okay, a testament to his work as a blacksmith. So he was a very robust fellow. Okay, he had a handsome physique, big boned, hardy, handsome, but pining till time when reason rambled in it. So gradually it declined. Okay, so gradually it actually deteriorated. It shows the slow, the painful process of Randall's deterioration till time when reason rambled it and some fatal for disorders. So it basically shows that how he was actually afflicted, how he was affected by such disease. Okay. And here, when he refers to that fatal for disorder, the poet is probably making a reference to the theory of four humors, a medieval system that reminds us of the theory of Dr. Galen, where it was believed that a healthy body is a sum total of the four elements within a human being. Okay, so these four elements were the black bile, the yellow bile, blood, and the flame. So when these four elements are in perfect order, one basically has a healthy body. And if one of the elements is out of order, then problem comes. Okay, so this perhaps a reference to the reference to the theory of four humors. So the fatal four disorders. So perhaps such illness actually that gripped him, that actually made his or occasioned that premature death, all contended. So the opening lines reflect the poet's grief, but at the same time, a sense of duty, the physical and the mental decline of Felix Randal, and the harsh realities of illness and death. Death can come to anyone. Okay, this is the reality. So, such a healthy, able brained, robust human being like Felix Randal had a sudden death. And then the poet tells in the second stanza, sickness broke him, impatient he cursed at first, but mended being anointed and all, though a heavenlier heart began some months earlier, since I had our sweet reprieve and ransom tender to him, a well God rest him all road, ever he offended. So it shows the condition of that blacksmith who actually mends horses' shoes. And it shows that how Hopkins, as a priest, had ministered to his final illness. Okay. And it also depicts the initial reaction of Randall when he was struck by that illness. So sickness broke him at first. At first, he was impatient. So initially, when Randall was down with fever, when Randall was down with that sickness, he was initially frustrated. He was initially angry about this. He was impatient. But gradually, this attitude changed after being anointed. Anointed is actually the religious comfort that the poet actually had given to him. Okay, so being anointed with the religious consolation, with that spiritual guidance that anointed him. And as a result of that, his heart was changed. He actually approached death differently from a from a spiritual perspective. That was the heavenlier heart. His heart was changed. There was a transformation. The transformation was basically the spiritual transformation that began months earlier when Hopkins, as a priest, offered him the spiritual guidance, the spiritual comfort. That was the sweet reprieve and ransom. Okay, so when Hopkins says that he tendered ransom to the young man before the person died, this metaphor basically tells that the poet, in his capacity as a priest, was able to give him something that had been stolen from him by his illness, and perhaps the ability to view death from a spiritual perspective. This is something that Hopkins, as a priest, was able to administer to him, to teach him that don't get impatient, don't curse, but accept it, and the sort of the spiritual guidance that the priest provided Felix Randal with. Will God rest him all road ever he offended. So the final line is a sort of prayer for God's mercy on Felix Randal, acknowledging that he may have sinned or may have offended in his life. So he is praying to God so that he may have mercy on him. Okay, so these lines present a narrative of physical decline and spiritual upliftment. They depict the journey of a man from the anger and impatience of his illness to the peace and acceptance of his impending death, facilitated by the compassionate ministry of the poet. Okay, so will God rest him all road ever he offended. The third stanza, this seeing the sick endears them to us to it endears. My tongue had taught thee comfort, touch had quenched thy tears, the tears that touched my heart, child. Felix, poor Felix Randal. So the third stanza explores the relationship between a priest and a parishioner. Felix Randal and Hopkins. Hopkins was a priest, parishioner Felix Randal. Okay, so they reflect that deep bond that has formed between the priest and the parishioner. This seeing the sick endears them to us. So it suggests that the process of caring for the sick, of seeing their suffering, makes them dear to us. That is, it increases our affection and care for them. But Hopkins also suggests that the process of caring for the sick endears us to ourselves, perhaps by making us more aware of our own capacity for compassion and empathy. So it is not a sort of one-way traffic. It is not that the poet only offered him consolation, only offered him the spiritual guidance. The reverse is also true. The, the kind of energy, the ebullience of which Randall was representative of, also had a profound impact on the poet. Us to it endears. So the poet is a knowledgeable priest, and he was working in a primarily official capacity based on his ability to offer an authoritative religious perspective. But he is a human being. And there is a strong sense here that what he gained from Felix Randal was as important as what he was able to offer. My tongue had taught thee comfort. Touch had quenched thy tears. So it shows that the poet was able to provide him with comfort, with religious healing. The poet reflects on his role in comforting Felix during his illness, and his words and his physical care, both served to provide solace to Felix. Okay, but this care was not only one sided. That's why the poet writes this line: Thy tears that touched my heart, child Felix, poor Felix Randal. So it was not one sided care from a priest to a parishioner. Felix's suffering, Felix's tears also touched the speaker's heart. That deepens his feeling of connection and empathy. So these lines reflect a deepening of the emotional connection and mutual care that arises from the process of illness and death. So they suggest that such experiences, while painful, can also be deeply bonding and transformative for those involved. The last stanza: How far from then forethought of all thy more boisterous years, when thou at the random grim forge, powerful amidst peers, didst fettle for that great grey horse his bright and battering sandal. So the last stanza is a poignant meditation on the death of a farrier whom Hopkins had ministered in his capacity as a priest. So these lines recapitulate the physical strength and vitality that he had once possessed. The words boisterous years, it shows a time of health, a time of vigor, while the description of Randal at the random grim forge, powerful amidst peers, that conjures an image of him in his prime, strong, skilled, when he was a healthy fellow, when he was respected by his fellow blacksmiths. So, a picture of the healthy Randal during his peak time, during his youth, that is something that the poet projects here. He is reminded of his physical strength, he is reminded of his vigor, reminded of his health, physical strength. Okay, so didst fettle for that great grey horse. So that shows specific reference to Randal's work as a farrier. To fettle means to prepare, arrange, and great grey horse refers to a large horse that Randal would have showed. And this, remember that this picture of a great grey horse also reminds one of Felix Randal himself. Here, the horse is also a metaphor for the vitality of Felix Randal. The horse, as a symbol, always represents that vitality, represents that energy. And these are the qualities, these are the attributes that the poet had given to Randal at the same time. Okay, so he was as healthy as a horse. So here, when he is talking about that horse, okay, in the last stanza, the great grey horse, it is not only a reference to that horse, particular horse, that big horse actually, but it also metaphorically refers to Randall's healthy body in his youth, in his prime time, when he was free from any sort of illness. Okay, so these lines actually serves as a stark contrast to the sick and dying man that Hopkins had described earlier. In that poem, in that sonnet, there is a volta, the turn of thought that comes after first 8 lines in the sestet portion. From the line number 9, you find a turn of thought. The first 8 lines that contains the octave, they are full of melancholy, but the sestet, where you find that the poet is not talking about his ill health, but he is reminding himself of the happy prime time of this common man. So that's why I told that it is an elegy and an eulogy at the same time. A poem of lamentation plus a poem of praise. The sestet portion, the last 6 lines, that bring before us, first of all, the comfort that the poet also got from this man, how his tears had touched his soul. Okay, so that camaraderie, that bond of friendship that existed between these two persons. And lastly, the last stanza that contrasts his kind of ending stage of his life, the last stage of his life, with his prime time when he was so healthy, robust. So the great gray dray horse, there is a alliteration, okay, in this line, the alliterative jingle. So great gray dray horse, his bright and battering. So again, the repetition of this B sound. So the memory of Randall's past strength that underscores the depth of his physical decline, adding a layer of poignancy to the poem. Okay, so it is juxtaposed. On the one side, you get a snapshot of his healthy body during his youth, during his prime time. On the other hand, you see the deterioration that actually happened as a result of the long sickness or illness. So, in a broader sense, these lines can also be interpreted as a commentary on the fleeting nature of youth, the fleeting, the transient nature of youth. Nothing is permanent. No one can tell that when one can die. No matter how young one person is, death can swoop on anyone, irrespective of their age. So everything is evanescent, everything is transient. So this message, the fleeting nature of youth, that is also suggested. And the inevitability of mortality, you cannot escape death. But more than a rumination on the matter of death, Felix Randal is basically an exploration of the bond between a priest and a parishioner. Okay, and the poet in this text, Felix Randal, talks about his spiritual role, talks about his guidance that he had given to that young man when he was impatient, when he was angry, Okay, when at first he was down with disease, when he was initially distraught, okay, when he was pining, but later on, with the message that the poet had given to him, with the message of peace, with the message of the religion, with a proper mindset to accept the every situation, the person, that is Felix Randal, gradually understood, okay, that how to come to terms with this. So gradually a heavenlier heart that actually dawned in him. So gradually, as a result of that spiritual guidance, as a result of that spiritual kind of blessing that the priest had provided him with, there was a great transformation. Okay, and the poem also shows that the relationship is not a sort of one-way traffic, that the poet only provided the person with comfort. That person also given the poet a sort of guidance, a sort of energy. Okay, thy tears had touched my heart. He was also deeply moved by this man. So here it is a sort of religious poem, but his religion is not a bookish, recondite doctrine far removed from the realm of the reality. His religion is the religion of common man. Hopkins is foregrounding the rights of the common man. His poetry deals with the common man's problems. Initially, Hopkins had a doubt regarding his vocation as a poet, whether he can continue writing poetry when he became a Jesuit, when he joined that Society of Jesus. Isn't it a contradictory sort of job? How can he write poetry being a priest? So initially he had stopped writing poetry after becoming a member of the Jesuit school. But gradually his mind actually underwent a change. And he accepted this fact that they are not antagonistic to each other. One can write poetry even if one is a priest. There is no contradiction between these two. There is no enmity between these two. And both can supplement each other. So this poetry, Felix Randal, is a kind of supplement to his vocation as a priest. So he is also performing the duty as a priest to his parishioner. And this poetry is a part of that great design. Okay, so that is the central theme of Hopkins' poetry.